The last entry in my command log before the humans arrived reads as follows. Day 41. Ration draw reduced to 40% of standard. 14 personnel non-ambulatory due to wounds sustained in the Drain Voss assault on the Eastern Transit Dock. Beacon signal confirmed transmitting on secondary frequency. No response from Coalition Relay. No response from the AI 6th Logistics Arm. No response from the Conclave Emergency Channel. Signal continues. Recommend station personnel begin psychological preparation for loss of station. I wrote that entry at the 3rd hour of the amber cycle, sitting in the command shelter with the heating coils on minimum draw, and my second pair of arms folded against my thorax for warmth. The moon Okrak orbits has no name anyone bothered to give it. The station built on that moon was meant to be a waypoint, a fueling stop, a cargo transfer node, a place where ships paused for 12 hours and then continued on to somewhere more important. It was never designed to be held. It was never designed to be besieged. It was certainly never designed to house 63 Veth'kai garrison personnel through 41 days of blockade on half rations, with a Drain Voss picket line sitting across the main approach lane, like a patient predator waiting for its prey to simply stop moving. I am Keth Sorovar. I commanded Okrak Station for 7 months before the Drain Voss moved on the Outer Reach Transit Corridor. I commanded the 63 survivors of the initial assault for 41 days after that. I am telling this account now because someone should, and because the Coalition's official record of the Okrak relief operation contains several factual errors, the most significant of which is the claim that a Veth'kai Conclave rapid response team arrived on day 43 and resolved the blockade situation. That did not happen. What happened was considerably stranger, considerably more humbling, and considerably harder to explain to a senior logistics committee that had already prepared the paperwork to write Okrak Station off as a total operational loss. I will tell it from the beginning. The Drain Voss are not technically an enemy of the Veth'kai. They are what the diplomatic corps calls a competing interest. They contest transit rights along the Outer Reach Corridor because those rights are worth money, and because the Drain Voss have discovered over many generations that contesting things is generally more profitable than resolving them. They do not fight pitched battles. They do not declare wars. They position their picket vessels across approach lanes and they wait, and they send messages through back channels suggesting that certain administrative adjustments to corridor access fees would make the whole situation go away, and they continue to wait. They had been waiting at Okrak for 41 days. They had destroyed our primary communications array on day 2, which was why we were transmitting on the secondary beacon, low power, a signal that would take 3 days to reach the nearest coalition relay, and likely several more days after that before anyone with authority to act on it decided whether acting on it was worth the political complexity of antagonizing the Drain Voss. I did not expect anyone to come. I want to be clear about that because it matters to what follows. I sent the signal because the regulations require a commanding officer to exhaust available communication options before recommending station abandonment to her personnel. The signal was not optimism, it was procedure. I had 41 days of evidence that optimism was an unaffordable luxury at Okrak Station, and I had spent most of those 41 days trying to expend it as carefully as the rations. The wounded in the eastern shelter needed a surgeon. We had a medic, Tak Voral, who had trained for standard field trauma and was doing work that I am certain no training program had prepared him to do. 3 of the 14 non-ambulatory personnel would not survive another week without surgical intervention beyond what TAC could provide. The rest of us needed food, not emergency rations, food. The kind that keeps a chitinous body's secondary joints from seizing, the kind with the trace mineral compounds that regulate the molt cycle, the kind that a Veth'kai garrison is supposed to have access to as a matter of basic operational continuity. We had 40% of standard draw. We had been at 40% for 11 days. Before that, we had been at 60%. Before that, standard draw, for about a week after the initial assault, while I was still telling myself that the coalition response was simply delayed. The signal I sent was specific. I have the text of it in my records. It read, Okrak Station, Commanding Officer Keth Saravar, Veth'kai Garrison 41 days under Drain Voss blockade, primary comms destroyed, 63 personnel, 14 wounded, 3 critical, rations at 40% draw. Request, medical personnel with surgical capability, any quantity of standard Veth'kai field rations, transit route clearance if available. Situation deteriorating. Signal repeating. Any quantity. That is what I asked for. Any quantity of rations. A single medic with surgical training. If someone could manage transit route clearance, that would also be appreciated. I was not in a position to be specific about quantities. I was in a position to be grateful for whatever arrived, if anything arrived, which I had assessed at roughly 20% probability. Given the coalition's demonstrated response time to low-priority signals from contested transit corridors and the political complexity of the Drain Voss situation. I want you to understand what 41 days of that kind of arithmetic does to a commanding officer's frame of mind. You begin to think in very small units. You count things. You count the ration packs in the secondary stores and divide them by the number of personnel and the number of days, and you arrive at a number. And then you count again, because the first number cannot be right. You count the functioning heating coils. You count the wounds that are stable versus the wounds that are not. You count the Drain Voss picket vessels on the approach. There were 4 of them, spaced across the lane at standard interdiction intervals, doing nothing except existing, and you arrive at the calculation that any supply ship attempting the main approach would be interdicted before it reached docking range, and you file that calculation away in the part of your mind where you keep the things you cannot fix. On day 42, at the 2nd hour of the amber cycle, my communications officer Pren Etherak picked up a signal on a frequency we were not monitoring because no one uses it. The frequency in question belongs to what the charts classify as the Southern Secondary Transit Lane, an unmapped approach route that runs along the galactic south of the Outer Reach Corridor. It appears on navigation charts as a dotted line with the annotation, Transit not recommended, gravitational anomalies, survey incomplete. The Drain Voss picket line was positioned across the main approach. No one had bothered to position anything across the Southern Secondary Lane because no one uses the Southern Secondary Lane. The gravitational anomalies along its length are real. The survey is genuinely incomplete. Traveling it requires either very good navigational equipment or a degree of willingness to accept certain risks that most freight operators consider commercially irrational. The signal Pren picked up was a standard logistics hail in Veth'kai trade register format. It identified the transmitting vessel as the ECV consistent argument, listed a human registration out of a port I had to look up, a station called Meridian Cross, which turned out to be a human-operated freight hub in a system I had heard of only in passing. The hail requested docking clearance for a convoy of 5 vessels, and asked whether the station's Eastern Transit dock was operational. Pren stood at my station doorway for a moment before she spoke. I remember the exact angle of her antennae perpendicular, which in our cast signals careful uncertainty, the posture of someone delivering information they are not confident is accurate. She said, "Commander, I have a docking request from a human freight convoy coming up the Southern Secondary Lane." I said, "Say that again." She said it again. I went to the communications shelter myself. I listened to the hail myself. It was indeed a logistics hail in trade register format. The voice delivering it was human, a flat, unhurried voice, the kind you hear from operators who have been doing their job for a long time and have no particular need to perform urgency. The vessel identification was genuine. I ran it through the station registry, and it came back as a licensed human freight carrier. 6 years of operational record, cargo transport, no flags. The other 4 vessels in the convoy were listed in the Hale's appendix. 2 more freight carriers, a vessel registered as a mobile medical unit under Human Relief Corps certification, and something classified simply as Escort, Registry EHF Title Argument, which when I pulled its registration came back as a human frontier frigate, armed, commissioned, active service. A frontier frigate. I sat with that for a moment. A frontier frigate, traveling the southern secondary transit lane, accompanying a freight convoy, requesting docking clearance at a station it had apparently been navigating toward through unmapped space for, I ran the calculation, at minimum 4 days. They had been in transit before my signal reached the nearest coalition relay. They had left before anyone in the coalition had formally acknowledged that Akrak Station needed help. I asked Pren, "Is there a second frigate in that convoy?" She checked the signal appendix again. She said, "Yes, Commander, there are 2. The second one is listed further back, running sensor sweep. EHF open argument. 2 frontier frigates, 3 freight carriers, a mobile medical unit, coming up the southern secondary lane through gravitational anomalies on an incomplete survey route, through space that no reasonable freight operator would use, toward a station that had sent a low-power distress signal 3 days ago on a secondary beacon." I granted docking clearance. I'm not sure what else I would have done. I told Pren to inform the convoy that the eastern transit dock had sustained structural damage, but that the western dock was functional, and I asked her to transmit our wounded count and our current ration status on the assumption that the convoy's manifest might be relevant to our needs. She did. The response came back in under 2 minutes. A different human voice this time, slightly younger, equally unhurried. Received. Medical unit will dock first, western slip 2. Barges 1 and 2 on western slips 3 and 4. Barge 3 will hold in approach orbit pending dock clearance for offload queue. Frigates will take up position at 2,000 units on the main approach axis. Please confirm your station's primary wounded are ambulatory or require extraction from current location. Please confirm. It took me a moment to process the organizational ease of that transmission. They had already sorted their docking queue. They had already assigned the medical unit priority slip. They had already decided where to put the frigates. They were asking me to confirm a detail of logistics, not to accept or refuse the operation. The operation had already, apparently, begun. I confirmed that 7 of the 14 wounded were ambulatory and 7 required extraction from the eastern shelter. The voice said, "Copy. Extraction team on the medical unit will deploy to eastern shelter within 30 minutes of docking. Please have a guide ready at the western dock entrance." I stood in the communications shelter, and I thought about the phrase extraction team. A mobile medical unit does not normally have an extraction team. A mobile medical unit is a ship with surgical capacity and medical supplies. An extraction team is a capability you add when you are planning to move people from places they cannot move themselves. They had planned for the non-ambulatory wounded before I had confirmed how many there were. They had that capacity aboard before they received my inventory. They had brought it through the southern secondary transit lane on an incomplete survey route because it was a thing that might be needed, and being prepared for what might be needed was apparently how they operated. I sent TAC Vorel to meet them at the western dock. I sent 2 of my most mobile personnel with him. I told them to be courteous, to accept whatever assistance was offered, and to ask no questions that were not operationally necessary, because I did not yet have a frame of reference for what kind of questions would be appropriate, and I did not want to waste whatever social capital we had before I understood who we were dealing with. Then I went to the western dock observation bay, and I watched them come in. The medical unit docked first, as they had said. It was a human design, boxy, practical. The running lights a warm amber color. The the hull showing the kind of careful patchwork maintenance that speaks of a ship used hard and kept operational through deliberate effort rather than easy supply. The ramp came down and 3 humans walked out, and behind them came a wheeled extraction platform, the kind designed to move personnel who cannot walk, and behind that came 2 more humans pushing equipment crates on a gravity sled. They were moving at the pace of people who have done this before and know exactly how much time each step takes. Not hurrying, not dawdling, moving at the precise speed that gets the most done. The human at the front of the group was a woman, shorter than I expected from what I knew of human physiognomy, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that has spent considerable time making rapid assessments and acting on them. She was wearing a white and gray garment that I later learned is the standard uniform of a human relief corps surgeon. She shook Tak Voral's hand, a human greeting gesture. I had read about it, and she said something to him, and he gestured toward the eastern corridor, and she nodded and the group began moving. I watched them until they were out of sight around the corridor bend. Then I turned back to the dock window. The second and third members of her team had paused at the base of the ramp. One of them, a young human, barely adult by what I understood of their developmental stages, with the kind of focus in his expression that comes from being given a serious task and taking it seriously, was inventorying the equipment cases against a manifest on his handheld unit. The other was speaking into a communications headset, relaying something back to the medical unit on the dock. They were calm. Not nervously calm, the kind of forced composure you see in people who are afraid but managing it. The genuine calm of people who are focused on work and find the work sufficient occupation for their attention. I have thought about that distinction often since. 41 days of managing a garrison under siege teaches you to read stress in the bodies of your personnel. You learn the set of shoulders that is holding something back. You learn the angle of antennae, or, in the case of humans, the tension around the jaw and the set of the brow. That means someone is operating at the edge of their reserves. Those 2 human technicians were not at any such edge. They were at the dock of an unfamiliar species besieged waypoint station, preparing to carry medical equipment through a damaged corridor to a cargo bay full of critically wounded aliens. And they looked like people who had an assignment and were glad to have one. It was, I realized, the same expression I had seen in every member of the convoy so far. Not eagerness, nothing performed or theatrical about it. Just the quiet engagement of people for whom this work was the work, and the work was sufficient. The 2 freight barges were coming in. They were large. I knew how large standard human freight barges were from the operational registry, but knowing a number and watching a ship fill your dock approach are different experiences. Each barge was configured for bulk cargo transfer, the kind of configuration you use when you are moving significant quantities of material, not the kind you use for a targeted delivery of specific requested items. They docked in slips 3 and 4 with the efficiency of ships whose crew had done this maneuver many times, and the offload doors were open before the docking clamps had fully settled. I saw the cargo manifests on my station display as they transmitted them. I read through the first one twice. The first barge was carrying AI standard field rations, the correct formulation, the one with the trace mineral compounds. It was carrying enough to feed 63 personnel for 14 months at full draw, not 40% draw. Full draw. 14 months. I read that figure again. The second barge was carrying what the manifest described as supplementary nutritional supplies, which turned out to mean a quantity of shelf-stable prepared foodstuffs beyond the standard field ration packs. The kind of provisions you bring when you want people to not just survive, but to recover, to eat something that tastes like a meal rather than a caloric calculation. It was also carrying medical consumables, bandaging materials, fluid replacement compounds, the specific anticoagulant compounds that AI field medics use for carapace trauma, analgesic compounds, a portable imaging unit. The kind of thing a field medic like Tak Vorel would need in order to stop doing the impossible with inadequate equipment. The third barge was still holding in approach orbit. The manifest it had transmitted showed construction materials, structural repair components for a transit dock, the specific type of component needed for the kind of damage the eastern dock had sustained in the initial assault. They had brought materials to repair our dock. I had not mentioned the dock damage in my distress signal except to note that it had sustained structural damage. I had not asked for repair materials. I had asked for food and a medic. I called the convoy's lead ship on the channel Pren had established. I was connected to the voice I had heard in the original hail, the flat, unhurried one. I said, "This is Station Commander Keth Sorovar. I need to understand the scope of what you are delivering." The human voice said, "We received your distress signal 3 days ago. We were already in transit, had been for about 2 days before that when the signal hit our relay. We came as loaded as we could get the barges in the time we had. What you're seeing on the manifest is what we had available that matched your situation." I said, "You were already in transit before my signal reached the relay." He said, "Our logistics coordinator picked up the secondary beacon frequency. We'd been monitoring that approach corridor for about a week. There'd been drain-vast traffic that suggested a blockade situation developing. When your signal came in, we had enough to go on." I said, "You came through the southern secondary lane." He said, "Faster than waiting for the main approach to clear. The gravitational anomalies aren't as bad as the survey charts suggest. You just have to take it at low speed and watch your instruments." I want to record that exchange precisely, because it contains something I spent several days afterward trying to fully process. They had been monitoring the corridor for a week. Their logistics coordinator had been watching for a signal that might indicate a blockade. When the signal came, they had already been preparing to load, and they had loaded and departed before the signal had reached the official coalition relay, before anyone in any official capacity had acknowledged that Okrak Station was in distress. They had gone through a transit lane that navigation charts describe as inadvisable because it was faster. The gravitational anomalies, in the assessment of the human pilot who had just navigated them, were not as bad as charted. He had said this in the tone of someone describing a moderate inconvenience, the way you might describe an approach lane that has slightly heavier traffic than usual. I asked why. There was a brief pause. Not a long one, not the kind of pause that suggests the question is uncomfortable. The kind of pause that suggests the person is choosing the most efficient way to answer a question they find straightforward, but that they understand may not be straightforward to the person asking it. He said, "You sent a distress signal." I said, "There are proper coalition channels for that." He said, "Yes. Those channels also have response timelines. You had 14 critical and non-critical wounded, and a ration situation that didn't have 3 weeks to wait for a coalition committee to authorize a response package." I said, "You are a freight operator." He said, "We operate freight. We also operate a relief capacity when the situation calls for it. The consistent argument's been doing relief ops for about 9 years alongside the freight work. It's the same equipment mostly. You adjust the manifest." I closed the communication and stood at the observation window for a while. Outside, the dock crews were beginning the offload process. The humans moved with the same unhurried efficiency as the medical team. No theater, no performance of effort, just people who knew what needed doing and were doing it. One of the dock crew, a young human, lighter built than the others, was consulting with my own personnel on the loading platform, apparently getting a briefing on the station's storage layout so they could route the supply flow correctly. My personnel were giving directions, and the human was noting them on a handheld device and nodding. The interaction looked entirely routine. Two species who had barely acknowledged each other's existence 6 weeks ago, standing on a dock in the middle of a contested transit corridor, discussing the most efficient route from the barge to the secondary stores. I went to the Eastern Shelter. I want to describe the Eastern Shelter as I found it, because it is important context. The Eastern Shelter is a repurposed cargo bay. We had lost our dedicated medical bay in the initial assault, with jury-rigged heating and a collection of sleeping pallets and improvised support equipment that Tak Vorel had assembled over 41 days of doing the best he could with what he had. It smelled of antiseptic compound and the particular dry metal smell of recycled air that has been cycling through too many lungs for too long. The 14 non-ambulatory personnel were in varying states, some conscious and alert, watching the door, some not conscious, some in the gray zone between the two that is the hardest to look at. The human surgeon was already working. She had set up a field surgical station in the corner of the shelter with a speed that suggested a great deal of practice. One of her team was monitoring a patient on the imaging unit. Another was running fluid lines. The surgeon herself was at the second most critical patient, one of my carapace trauma cases, a young sentry named Veth'kai who had taken direct impact from a drain Voss breaching charge and had been, in Tak Vorel's quiet assessment 3 days ago, unlikely to last another week. I watched the surgeon work for a moment. Tak Vorel was beside her, and they appeared to be communicating through a combination of translation device and hand gestures, and it was working. The surgeon had apparently taken a rapid briefing on Veth'kai anatomy at some point. She was working with the confidence of someone who has studied the relevant material, not with the hesitation of someone encountering it for the first time. She had the correct anticoagulant compound from the second Barges medical supplies drawn and ready. She was also speaking in a low voice, partly to Tak, who was operating the secondary lines, and partly to Veth'kai, who was conscious and watching her with the particular stillness of someone in significant pain who has decided that holding completely still is the safest available option. She was not speaking in words Veth'kai would understand. She was using tone, the register of a human voice that apparently communicates something across a great many biological configurations. I know what I am doing, hold on, this is going to be all right. Veth'kai was watching her. After a moment, the set of his secondary limbs eased slightly, the microtension releasing the way it does in a body that has decided, on some level below language, to accept the situation it is in. I have thought about that moment since. 41 days of managing personnel under siege teaches you to watch the body language of those in your care very carefully. You learn the difference between someone who is frightened and managing it and someone who has genuinely, if only temporarily, stopped being frightened. Veth'kai, who had been in continuous acute pain for 3 weeks and who had been in an unfamiliar species medical care for approximately 20 minutes, had stopped being frightened. The surgeon had produced this result by speaking to him in a language he did not understand, in a tone that apparently needed no translation. I asked Tak quietly when the surgeon was focused on the patient, did she know our biology? He said she had materials. She studied them on the approach. 4 days in transit. She had studied Veth'kai trauma medicine during the transit through the southern secondary lane. She had navigated gravitational anomalies and studied the biology of a species she had apparently decided she was going to need to treat before she had confirmation that she would be allowed to treat them. I went back to the command shelter and I looked at my signal log. I looked at the coalition channels, all of which were still showing no response. The nearest coalition relay had acknowledged receipt of my beacon signal on day 43, which was today. The acknowledgement did not contain any indication of action being taken. It was an automated receipt confirmation. Somewhere in the coalition administrative structure, my distress signal was sitting in a queue waiting for someone with authorization to evaluate it and prepare a response recommendation to take to a committee, which would then discuss the political complexity of the Drain Voss situation, which would then likely result in a request for more information, which I would not be able to provide efficiently because my primary communications array was destroyed. Outside my shelter window, a human freight operator was offloading 14 months of full-draw rations onto my dock. His colleagues were operating a surgical suite in my eastern cargo bay. His 2 frigates were sitting at 2,000 units off the main approach axis, not announcing themselves, not challenging the Drain-Voss picket line, simply sitting there with their transponders on, visible to anyone who was looking. I spent the next several hours touring the offload operation. I want to record what I observed because I did not fully believe the manifest figures until I saw them in physical form. The ration barges unloaded in just over 9 hours. My personnel worked alongside the human dock crews, and I observed during that time that the humans were patient, communicative, and entirely uninterested in any recognition for what they were doing. There was no ceremony. There was no moment where the human convoy commander appeared on the dock and made a speech. The lead ship's operator, whose name I eventually learned was Reyes Marchetti, a heavyset human with a close-trimmed beard and the calm demeanor of someone who has resolved a great many logistical problems and has stopped finding them surprising, appeared at the dock twice during the offload. Both times he was checking on specific cargo routing questions with my personnel. He was not checking to see how grateful we were. He was checking whether the store's routing was proceeding correctly. I found myself watching my own personnel as much as I watched the offload. 41 days of siege does visible things to a body, and I had been in it too long to see it clearly in myself, but I could see it in the others. There is a particular quality to how a Veth'kai moves when their mineral intake has been reduced for an extended period. The secondary joints stiffen, the antennae lose range of motion, the gait becomes slightly compressed, conserving energy in ways the body does before the mind has consciously registered the decision. I had been watching that compression in my garrison for weeks. It is not a dramatic deterioration. It is a slow mechanical degradation, the kind that you do not notice on any single day, and that reveals itself suddenly when you are watching for it from a slight remove. What I noticed in the second hour of the offload was that one of my personnel, a supply specialist named Veth'kai, who had been moving at that compressed gait for the past 3 weeks, was moving faster. Not much, enough to notice. He was working the cargo routing alongside a human dock crew member, and he was moving like someone who had been told there was enough, and had believed it, and whose body was updating its calculations accordingly. I catalogued that observation and filed it away. At one point I was standing near the dock entrance when Marchetti passed, and I said, "Why the construction materials? I did not ask for dock repair components." He said, "Your eastern dock is down. A station with only one functioning dock is operationally vulnerable. We had the materials, we had the barge capacity. It seemed worth including." I said, "It must have cost a considerable amount to load all of this on your timeline." He said, "We've been doing this long enough to keep a standing inventory of relief supplies at Meridian Cross. We don't always need all of it. When we need it fast, so we keep it stocked. The dock components were in the secondary warehouse. They matched your dock spec within tolerance, so we loaded them." Standing inventory. A freight operator, running a commercial route along the outer reach corridor, maintaining a standing inventory of relief supplies because sometimes stations need help on short notice. He had said this the way you might say, "We keep a spare actuator for the docking clamps because sometimes clamps fail." As if this were simply part of reasonable operational planning. As if maintaining 14 months of Veth'kai field rations and a full set of transit dock repair components in secondary storage, on the off chance that a distress signal came in from a species you were not in any formal agreement with, was an obvious and unremarkable thing to do. That evening, the amber star had moved to the low angle that my body reads as evening regardless of the station's formal clock cycle. I received a communication from the surgeon, whose name was Adiz Nwasu, and who had apparently decided at some point during the day that direct communication with the station commander was more efficient than routing through the convoy lead. She reported that Veth'kai was stable and would likely recover full function in 3 to 4 weeks. She reported that 2 other critical cases were stable. She reported that the remaining 11 non-ambulatory personnel had been assessed and that 7 of them could be reclassified as ambulatory with appropriate support and modified duties. She asked whether the station had a dietary tracking system that she could review to assess the nutritional recovery protocol for the personnel who had been on reduced rations. I told her we had a basic system. She said she would need access to it in the morning. I granted access. She thanked me briskly and ended the communication. I went back to the observation window. The approach axis was dark except for the running lights of the 2 frigates, which had not moved from their position at 2,000 units. The Drain-Voss picket line was still on the main approach. The 4 Drain-Voss vessels had not moved since the convoy arrived, but they had also not attempted to interdict the convoy's approach through the southern lane. I was trying to understand what calculation the Drain-Voss were running. They were watching 2 human frontier frigates sit at 2,000 units off the main approach axis, and they were doing nothing. I learned the answer 2 days later. On day 44, I received a communication from the lead frigate, the EHF title argument, from an officer who identified herself as Commander Sheila Vasquez. She spoke in the same flat, unhurried register as every other human I had spoken to in the past 2 days. She said, "Commander Sorovar, we've been in contact with the Drain-Voss picket leader. They've indicated willingness to withdraw from the main approach lane, pending a corridor access fee renegotiation with your coalition's transport authority. We've offered to act as a neutral party in that communication if it's useful to you. Alternatively, if you'd prefer we facilitate a direct withdrawal without the negotiation component, we can do that." I said, "What does facilitating a direct withdrawal without the negotiation component involve?" She said, "It involves having a conversation with the picket leader about the tactical situation and the fact that the corridor is no longer under effective blockade from a supply standpoint. They're rational actors. They're running a commercial operation, not a military campaign. If the leverage is gone, they'll recalculate." I said, "And the leverage is gone because you are here." She said, "The leverage was always thin. A 4-vessel picket line against a station that could wait them out if it had supplies was never a strong position. We've addressed the supply situation. They can read that as easily as anyone." The tactical logic she was describing was, of course, correct. The Drain-Voss had been waiting for Akrak station to run out of the capacity to wait. The station no longer had that problem. The Drain-Voss picket line was now a 4-vessel force sitting across an approach lane to a station that had 14 months of rations, a functional medical operation, 2 human frigates at 2,000 units, and an operational dock. The commercial calculation had shifted completely. They had no leverage left, and a non-trivial amount of exposure if the situation escalated. I told Commander Vasquez to proceed with whatever approach she recommended. She said she'd handle it, and she'd send a summary communication when it was resolved. It was resolved within 4 hours. The Drain-Voss picket line withdrew to a holding position outside the main corridor approach. Commander Vasquez sent me a summary that was 3 sentences long. Drain-Voss picket withdrew to holding position at 1400 station time. Corridor clear on main approach axis. Recommend you notify coalition relay of approach clearance so they can update navigational advisories. 3 sentences. 41 days of blockade, resolved in 4 hours of communication by a human frigate commander who had described the process as having a conversation with the picket leader. I sent the coalition relay the navigational update. I am not certain anyone at the relay fully understood what they were updating, given that they had only acknowledged my distress signal 11 hours earlier. On day 45, The third barge, the one with the dock repair components, moved into approach and offloaded its cargo. The human dock crew that came with it included what turned out to be two structural engineers, who spent the day assessing the eastern dock damage and marking components for the repair sequence. They left detailed repair instructions with my engineering team, annotated in AI technical notation, apparently translated from human standard by a reference system aboard the consistent argument. My chief engineer, a meticulous individual named Sorvin, who had spent 41 days cataloging everything that had gone wrong and would not permit himself to believe the catalog was being addressed, stood with one of the human engineers for 2 hours going through the repair schematic and asking questions. I watched them from across the dock. The human engineer answered every question with the same unhurried competence. Sorvin's antennae, which had been at the flattened angle of chronic stress since the beginning of the siege, were by the end of that conversation at a more neutral set. I noticed that. I noticed it because for 41 days I had been watching what sustained deprivation does to a garrison, and watching it reverse in real time felt like something I did not have adequate vocabulary for. The precise moment I remember most clearly from that day was not the offload, and not the schematic review, and not the communications from Commander Vasquez's frigate, which had been broadcasting a quiet but unmistakable presence on the approach axis all morning. It was late in the amber cycle, when the offload was nearly complete, and most of my personnel had rotated through at least one full-draw meal from the first Barges supplies. I was walking the corridor between the western dock and the secondary stores when I heard, ahead of me, something I had not heard in Akrak Station in 41 days. Two of my personnel were arguing about the most efficient sequence for restocking the secondary stores, not in the compressed, careful way that people argue when they are conserving energy. In the ordinary, animated way. Vorak Ethan was insisting that the grain composites should go in before the mineral supplements on the grounds that the grain crates' dimensions were more compatible with the secondary store's shelving configuration. The other specialist, a young carapastender named Isath Varek, was arguing with equal certainty that the mineral supplements should go in first because they had the shorter shelf access timeline for the recovery protocol. It was a genuine dispute about a logistical question with a correct answer, and both of them had enough metabolic reserves to care which answer was right. I stopped in the corridor and listened to them argue for a moment. Then I continued to the stores and made no comment. I noticed that. I will add it to the record because it belongs there. The first sign that the garrison was recovering its ordinary character was a disagreement about shelf-stacking order. After 41 days of controlled, careful, resource-conserved conduct, two of my personnel had enough energy and enough certainty about the future to argue about something minor. That, as much as any supply manifest figure, told me we were going to be all right. I noticed that. I noticed it because for 41 days I had been watching what sustained deprivation does to a garrison, and watching it reverse in real time felt like something I did not have adequate vocabulary for. That evening, Dr. Nwasu sent me the nutritional recovery protocol for the personnel who had been on reduced rations. It was a detailed document. It included a 12-week schedule, specific draw levels from the ration stores, a monitoring checklist, and a note at the end that read, "If you have questions at any point during implementation, you can reach me on the standard Human Relief Corps frequency. We monitor it continuously. I will be happy to consult." She would be, at that point, traveling back to Meridian Cross through the southern secondary transit lane. She was offering ongoing consultation from a ship in transit through gravitational anomalies. I read the note several times. Then I saved the frequency. On day 46, the convoy began preparing for departure. This was done with the same quiet efficiency as everything else. The barges sealed their cargo holds. The medical unit's team did a final round of patient assessments, transferred detailed care records to TAC Voral's system, and loaded their equipment. Marchetti and 2 of his crew did a final walk of the dock to confirm nothing had been left improperly secured. Commander Vasquez's frigate moved from its holding position to an approach queue position, signaling readiness for transit. I met Marchetti at the western dock entrance as the final crew members were boarding. I had been trying to compose something to say since day 43, and I had not found it. The Veth'kai have formal expressions of gratitude that are appropriate for different categories of debt. There are different registers for obligation to a superior, obligation to an equal, obligation to a subordinate who has rendered unexpected service. None of them quite fit what I was trying to express, because none of them were built for the specific situation of owing your station's survival to a species you had no formal relationship with, a species that had crossed unmapped space and navigated gravitational anomalies through a transit lane that navigation charts say not to use, for a garrison that asked for a medic and any quantity of food and received instead 3 barges, a surgical team, 2 frigates, dock repair materials, and a nutritional recovery protocol. I said, I need to understand what it is that I owe you. Marchetti looked at me for a moment. He had the expression of a human who is genuinely considering a question rather than preparing a polite deflection. He said, "Nothing, Commander. This isn't that kind of operation." I said, "You came through the southern secondary lane." He said, "We did." I said, "You loaded relief supplies before you had confirmation we had accepted your assistance." He said, "We loaded what the situation looked like it would need. If you hadn't needed it, we'd have taken it back." I said, "The frigates, the dock repair materials, the nutritional protocol." He said, "The frigates came because a convoy transiting contested space benefits from an escort, and because the escort turned out to be useful. The dock materials came because one dock isn't enough for operational continuity. The nutritional protocol came because Dr. Nwasu believes in complete handoffs." I said, "This was more than I asked for." He said, "Yes." I said, "I want to understand why." He was quiet for a moment. Not the pause of someone deciding what to say, the pause of someone allowing the weight of a question to be appropriate before answering it. He said, "You sent the signal. We heard it. When you hear it, you go. And when you go, you bring everything the situation might need because you don't always get a second trip." He extended his hand. I had seen the gesture 2 days ago, and I understood its meaning now. I placed the flat of one of my secondary hands against his palm, which I had read was an acceptable adaptation of the greeting for species without matching limb structure. He nodded. He walked up the boarding ramp. The ramp sealed. I stood at the dock window and watched the consistent argument undock and move into the approach queue behind the other vessels. The convoy formed up in the transit lane approach, the 2 barges running cargo empty, the 3rd barge, the medical unit, consistent argument, and the 2 frigates, one ahead and one behind. They moved to the southern secondary lane entry point. They were at departure speed within 12 minutes. I watched their running lights until the amber star's glare washed them out. I stood at the window for some time after that. I'm not certain how long. The dock was quiet behind me, my personnel had returned to their duties, the offload platforms had been secured, the cargo routing was complete. The station had the particular sound of a place where people have work to do and are doing it. I had not heard that sound in 41 days. The previous sound of Okrak Station had been the sound of a place that was conserving itself, moving minimally, running each system at the lowest sustainable level. This was a different sound. This was the sound of a garrison that had somewhere to put its energy and was putting it there. I thought about the southern secondary lane. I thought about what it takes, in practical terms, to navigate a route that the charts mark inadvisable. You need good instruments, which the consistent argument clearly had. You need a crew that trusts the instruments and the operator reading them. You need, on some level, the willingness to accept that the fastest route to where someone needs you is the right route, even if the charts suggest caution, even if the schedule is not your own, even if no formal agreement requires you to go at all. I have navigated difficult approaches in my career. I know what it means to commit to a transit lane entry at departure speed and trust the path through to the other side. You make the decision at the entry point and you hold it. You do not reevaluate midway through a gravitational anomaly. You go. They had gone. For 63 Veth'kai garrison personnel on a waypoint station on a dead moon around an unnamed planet, they had gone. I watched the amber stars light on the empty approach lane for a while longer. Then I went back to the command shelter and filed my log. It read, Convoy ECV consistent argument and associated vessels departed Okrak Station at 1810 station time. Station current status, 63 personnel, 0 critical wounded, 7 non-ambulatory reclassified as ambulatory with modified duties, ration stocks at full draw for estimated 14 months, Eastern Dock repair sequence initiated, main approach lane clear following drain VOS withdrawal. Coalition relay notified of approach clearance. Station operational continuity restored. Then I added a second paragraph, which is not required by the log format but which I wrote because I needed it to exist somewhere in the official record. It read, the relief operation was not conducted by any coalition entity. It was conducted by a human freight and relief operator, Reyes Marchetti, captain of ECV consistent argument, operating out of Meridian Cross Station, with surgical support from Dr. Adiz Nwasu, mobile medical unit, and escort provided by EHF tidal argument and EHF open argument, human frontier service vessels. The convoy arrived via the southern secondary transit lane, a route classified as inadvisable in current navigation charts. The operation was initiated before coalition acknowledgement of the distress signal was received. Supplies delivered exceeded the distress signal's request parameters by a margin that I lack precise vocabulary to quantify. The blockade situation was resolved through communication by the escort vessels within 4 hours of their positioning. No formal agreement, mutual aid treaty, or commercial arrangement exists between the AI Outer Reach Command and the operating entities involved. They came because we sent the signal. That is, as far as I am able to determine, the complete explanation. The Coalition Logistics Committee, when I presented this account at the review session 6 weeks later, asked me 3 times whether I was certain no prior commercial arrangement existed that might explain the convoy's presence. I told them 3 times that I was certain. They asked me whether the human operators had made any requests regarding corridor access or future routing agreements. I told them no requests of any kind had been made. They asked whether the convoy had taken any cargo from the station in exchange for the supplies delivered. I told them the convoy had taken nothing. They asked me what, in my assessment, the human operators had expected to receive in return for the operation. I said, I asked that question directly. The answer I received was that they heard the signal and they came, and they brought what the situation might need. I do not have a more complete explanation than that. The committee sat with that for a moment. Then the senior logistics coordinator said, in a tone that suggested she was recording it for the official file rather than addressing me personally, unusual. I said yes. She said commendably so. I said yes. I have thought about Marchetti's answer many times since that dock conversation. You send the signal, we hear it, we go. And when we go, we bring everything the situation might need, because you don't always get a second trip. I have turned it over in the way you turn over a statement that seems simple but keeps revealing new facets the longer you examine it. The part that stays with me is the last piece, because you don't always get a second trip. It is not a statement of altruism. It is not a statement of obligation. It is a statement of operational philosophy. The belief that if you are going to do the thing, you do the thing completely, because the universe does not guarantee you a chance to go back and finish what you started. They had come through the southern secondary lane because it was faster, and because faster meant more margin. They had brought the dock repair materials because a station with one dock was operationally vulnerable, and operational vulnerability might mean another distress signal before the first one was properly resolved. They had brought the nutritional recovery protocol because TAC Voral would be implementing it without the surgeon present, and having clear guidance was better than not having it. Every element of the operation traced back to the same logic. You do not know what you will encounter, so you bring everything that might be needed, and you do it completely, and you do it now. I do not know how many distress signals Reyes Marchetti has answered in 9 years of operating a relief capacity alongside his freight routes. I do not know how many transit lanes he has navigated that the charts describe as inadvisable. I do not know how many times he has loaded a convoy on a short timeline with supplies matched to a situation assessment rather than a formal request, and departed before the official channels had finished processing the paperwork that would have authorized someone else to do the same thing more slowly. I know only that the Veth'kai garrison at Okrak station is alive because he did it once more. 63 personnel, 14 who could not walk when he arrived, 7 of whom were walking when he left. One young sentry named Veth'kai who had been, in TAC Voral's quiet assessment, unlikely to last another week, and who is currently on duty rotation at Okrak Station's repaired eastern dock. The coalition, as I noted, has an official record of the Okrak relief operation. That record credits a Veth'kai conclave rapid response team with resolving the blockade situation. The rapid response team arrived on day 51, 5 days after the convoy departed. They found a functional station, a clear approach lane, a full ration inventory, 3 critical patients who were by that point stable and recovering, and a fairly detailed after-action report that I had prepared specifically because I expected someone to find the situation confusing without one. The Rapid Response Team's mission report describes their arrival as timely intervention. The report does not mention the consistent argument, or the southern secondary transit lane, or the 2 frigates, or the 14 months of rations, or Dr. Nwasu's nutritional protocol, or the dock repair sequence. This is not because the information was suppressed. It is because the Rapid Response Team, arriving to a functional station with no immediate crisis to address, had no operational reason to investigate how the crisis had been resolved, and so they did not. I submitted my after-action report to the Coalition Administrative Record. It sits there. I do not know how many people have read it. I have read it many times. I read it because I wrote the last paragraph of my Day 46 log entry, and I want to make sure that what is recorded is accurate, and that it remains accurate, and that the accurate version of events is somewhere in the official record, even if it is not the version the committee chose to lead with. The accurate version is this. We sent the signal on a secondary beacon, low power, on a channel no one was supposed to be monitoring, into a corridor where the official response timeline was measured in weeks and the political complexity was measured in committee sessions. A human freight operator with a standing inventory of relief supplies and 2 frontier frigates he could call on was monitoring that frequency because someone in his operation had determined that monitoring it was a reasonable part of operational planning. He loaded his barges in the time available. He navigated a transit lane that the charts say not to use. He arrived before the official channels had finished acknowledging that we had asked for help. He brought 3 times what we asked for and charged nothing for any of it. When I asked him why, he told me we had sent the signal. That is the complete explanation. I have checked it against every framework I have for understanding organizational behavior, interspecies obligation, commercial logic, and tactical decision-making, and I cannot find a more complete one. The Veth'kai did not have a treaty with humanity. The Outer Reach Command had no commercial relationship with Meridian Cross freight operators. The Galaxy's standard channels were processing our distress signal through their standard timelines. The humans heard the secondary beacon, assessed the situation, loaded everything the situation might need, and came through the unmapped dark to deliver it. The Amber Star is at the low angle again. The Eastern Dock has been operational for 4 weeks. Veth'kai came off modified duty 2 days ago. Tak Voral's medical bay, the real one, rebuilt from the Eastern cargo conversion, is running on the nutritional recovery protocol, and the personnel who were on reduced rations are, by every metric in the tracking system, recovering. Prax Sorvin's antennae are at a neutral set. 2 of my supply specialists spent 10 minutes yesterday arguing about shelf stocking order. These are, I am certain, the correct things to be observing in a garrison returning to its ordinary functioning. I keep the Human Relief Corps frequency in my communications log. Dr. Nwasu said they monitor it continuously. I have not needed to use it. I find that I am glad it is there. I find that I am glad they are the kind of people who would answer it if I did. I have not deleted it either.